My mom once bought the wrong set of Crayola crayons for my kids. She expected their eyes to light up at the usual rainbow of colors. Instead, they asked her why the box was filled with nothing but shades of brown. In 2020, Crayola released its Colors of the World crayons. The set included 24 tones representing over 40 global skin shades. It went on to win multiple awards, including Toy of the Year for Most Creative. But of course, it didn't take long before critics dismissed it as woke. America's history often collides with its ideals, none more so than on immigration. The nation's greatest symbol of welcome, the Statue of Liberty, literally calls out to the world to give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. But how does that promise hold up today? Scholars track public opinion on diversity, and the results are telling. Pew Research reports that 76% of Americans say it's either very good or somewhat good that the country is made up of many races and ethnicities. While skeptics may focus on the other 24%, the fact remains: 3 out of every 4 Americans support diversity. That's a sharp contrast with most of American history. It's also important because, as the Institute for Diversity Science notes, people often underestimate how much support there is for diversity, by as much as 20%. That misperception can create what they call a spiral of silence. If people believe others don't support diversity, they tend to stay quiet. Silence then reinforces more silence. And in the end, it can lead to behavior that runs against our personal values, like failing to speak out against injustice due to fear that no one else feels the way they do. Still, Americans don't always connect diversity with immigration. Polling reveals a gap. For example, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs found that 42% of Americans see large numbers of immigrants and refugees as a critical threat to the country over the next decade. Politics explains much of the divide. 7 in 10 Republicans say immigration is a critical threat, compared to just 2 in 10 Democrats. Studies show conservative Republicans on average react more strongly to fear. Sometimes this is fear of others, sometimes it's fear of new experiences. That's discouraging when it comes to immigration, especially given what science tells us. A peer-reviewed study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that while people do prefer to live among those they see as similar, contact with those who seem different, though stressful at first, leads to more positive views and fewer stereotypes. As diversity spreads across the country, America should be leaving prejudice in the rearview mirror, finally living up to the ideals carved into the Statue of Liberty. Yet the reality feels different. In politics especially, we see images that suggest otherwise. Some even ask how far back America must go in time to once again be great. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's dark history of xenophobia. Episode number 1, A Blueprint for the Nazis. Skin color as a marker of race is, at its core, a human invention. Biologically, our different tones evolved in response to UV radiation, how much the sun helped or harmed survival. Over thousands of years, as migration slowed, some populations produced less melanin, leading to lighter skin tones. Today, we call that Caucasian or white. Skin color isn't the only marker of race, but it's the most visible. So it has long been used to define who's in and subsequently who's out. The first official attempt to classify humanity by skin color came in 1735, when Karl Linnaeus borrowed from Aristotle to divide people into just 4 groups by geography and complexion. By that logic, Crayola's woke crayon box would have been oversupplied by about 20 shades. Linus even tied his categories to humoral theory, the idea that the 4 elements, air, water, fire, and earth, shaped climate, and in turn, people's bodies and characters. Of course, reality is far more complex. Linus had never left Western Europe. As scientists finally looked beyond their borders, they began to see race and skin color for what they were: arbitrary. Even Immanuel Kant struggled with the concept, once suggesting that all babies were born white, and only turned black, red, or yellow after a few weeks, thanks to their environment. Owing to humanity's natural tendency to fear the unknown, colorism was born. Like racism, imperialism, or capitalism, it has a long reach. Colorism refers to discrimination within a racial group based on shade, favoring lighter skin over darker. As researcher Mahama Rahman explains, this pushes darker-skinned people to the bottom of the social ladder, stripped of opportunities in education and work. Beyond outside prejudice, they may internalize those biases, turning to bleaching and other harmful practices to meet impossible beauty standards. In other words, colorism is deeply rooted in the foundations and structures of every culture worldwide. Skin bleaching is one way people have tried to achieve transraciality, the ability to pass as another race. Homer Plessy, famously just 1/8 white, passed as white to challenge segregation on passenger trains. Bias shows up in quieter ways too. The Southern Poverty Law Center notes that teachers often favor lighter-skinned students, while darker-skinned children are more likely to be seen as suspicious, disruptive, or even criminal. Breaking through implicit bias is hard. Nobody's perfect, not even Google. Search for Homer Plessy and you'll often see the wrong face, because there are no photos of Plessy. The internet filled that gap with images of PBS Pinchback, America's second black acting governor. It's ironic in a way. We now have a crayon box with 24 shades of human skin, but for most of American history, our institutions only recognize 2, white and colored. And among the history makers in the latter, it doesn't have a way to distinguish between them. Science should have been the tool to cut through myths about race and skin color. But when it came to colorism, pseudo-science made things worse. Eugenics carried the torch. If the 18th century reduced humanity to just 4 races tied to the elements, America in the 20th century went further still, collapsing it to just 2, white and colored. Those terms are most often associated with Jim Crow segregation. Those infamous signs telling people which water fountain to use weren't limited to the South. Historian Janine Theoharis reminds us that racism in America has too often been framed as a regional problem, not a national problem. In her words, when it comes to the North, people like to say racism was episodic and personal, not state-sponsored. Except we know that's not the case. The South looms so large in our imagination because schools tend to teach segregation through the lens of the civil rights movement, a moment where black leaders rightly take center stage. Students grow up associating Jim Crow signs with just 2 categories, white and black. But as Crayola understands, the spectrum is far more complicated. Take the Irish. At the turn of the 20th century, so-called experts spent both time and money arguing that the Irish weren't white. When Italians arrived, the debate reignited. Should they be grouped with Native Americans, with African Americans, with the Chinese? nobody seemed sure. Eventually, the Irish, Italians, Jews, and many Eastern European immigrants became white. This happened in a process sociologists call ethnic whitening. Historian David Roediger explores this in his book Working Towards Whiteness. He describes how each group was put on trial for a painfully long time, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation by bosses and landlords. In striving to fit in, many adopted the traits of whiteness, participating, knowingly or not, in a kind of transraciality. Roediger even describes the process as immigrants entering a whiteness factory, learning US-styled racism as they went. In a dark twist on an old African-American joke, the author notes how immigrants often learn to say okay as one of their first English words, and a vicious anti-black slur as their second. Looking back at these moments should help us see how far we've come, and how to avoid repeating mistakes as we move towards a truly multiracial society. But too often history reveals the opposite. The same tired, disproven arguments recycled against whichever group is on trial next. In this episode, we'll first explore the arguments leveled against white immigrants, before looking at how those same tactics were later used against the Chinese, the Jews, and Latinos. I hope that by examining these cycles, we can inch closer to the post-racial, loving society we claim to value. But after 200 years of history, I won't be holding my breath. The Founding Fathers talked a big game, but let's be honest, they rarely lived up to their own ideals. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, while he enslaved people. They passed laws for religious freedom, but built a system that heavily favored Protestant Christians. Even Benjamin Franklin, arguably the sharpest of the bunch, couldn't quite walk the talk. In 1755, Franklin made some complaints that still sound familiar today. First, that immigrants weren't assimilating. Second, that they were lowering the country's standards. He grumbled that newcomers were herding together, clinging to their language and customs instead of blending in. And while he admitted they helped develop the colony, he called them, his words, not mine, the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation. So yeah, Franklin was already playing the "they're not sending their best" card 250 years ago. Underneath the criticism, though, was a grudging admission. Immigration could help the country if the immigrants were exceptional, and if they adopted our way of life. Franklin's main target? The Germans. Back then, Pennsylvania was the hot spot for German migration. Founded by William Penn as a Quaker sanctuary, the colony had a unique origin story. In exchange for forgiving a debt owed to his father, the king granted Penn 45,000 square miles of land. With it, he had big plans. Quakers were radical for the 17th century. They believed everyone was spiritually equal, men and women, rich and poor. They rejected violence, limited slavery, and sought to dismantle rigid social hierarchies. But Penn wasn't just an idealist. He was a businessman. He wanted Pennsylvania to be both a safe haven for the persecuted and a profitable enterprise. Historian Alan Taylor explains that Penn welcomed not just Quakers or Brits, but anyone willing to work and contribute. He promised equal rights and opportunities to productive settlers, no matter their background. There was also a practical reason: defense. The Quakers wouldn't fight, but someone had to protect the frontier. German settlers became that human buffer between the colony and the volatile western border. During the French and Indian War, Franklin himself urged the colonies to join or die. and Taylor notes that having armed settlers and native allies out west allowed Pennsylvania to grow in relative peace. By the eve of the Revolution, about 1 million people had settled in the colonies. Roughly 1 in 10 were Germans, most in Pennsylvania. Why did they come? Migration usually boils down to 2 forces: push factors and pull factors. Being pushed means that you are driven from home. War, poverty, persecution, crop failure. Pull factors draw them to a new place. Available land, jobs, safety, freedom, or simply hope for a better life. For the Germans, both forces were at work. Southwestern Germany faced crop failures, religious tensions, political instability, and a collapsing economy. Many were pushed out, some to Hungary or Russia, but a large number to America. Pennsylvania, in turn, was pulling hard. Letters from early German settlers, nicknamed Newlanders, described the colony as a earthly paradise. Historian Erica Lee notes that land was abundant, with farms averaging 125 acres. That was 6 times larger than back home. The soil was rich, yielding 3 times as much wheat. Skilled workers were in demand, wages were good, taxes were low, there was no mandatory military service, and most importantly, there was freedom. These letters sparked chain migration. One family came over, then sent for relatives, neighbors, and friends. Step by step, Pennsylvania was reshaped by the very people Franklin feared would never fully become American. Half of all European migrants to America became indentured servants until they paid off the cost of their passage. In places like Virginia, half of these servants died before completing their terms, and another 25% remained landless even after their service. Gottlieb Mittelberger, a schoolmaster and organist from Germany, arrived expecting opportunity, but found misery. In his journey to Pennsylvania, he warned others against coming unprepared, describing German migrants so impoverished that some were selling their children like livestock. The first wave of German migrants had filled their niche perfectly and were rewarded for it. But the second wave sparked a new wave of xenophobia. The first wave had settled along the frontier, out of sight, out of mind. The second wave, however, was described in dehumanizing terms like swarms. Some colonists also claimed the newcomers held dual loyalty, ready to betray their new homeland at a moment's notice. Franklin, a known womanizer, even added a unique twist to the prejudice, proclaiming that German women were ugly. Most Pennsylvanians' fear wasn't just about culture or appearance. Pennsylvanians worried that the migrants might spark a war with Native Americans, a conflict that would threaten the well-being of the Quaker farmers who were relying on the Germans as a buffer zone along the frontier. As early as 1718, Pennsylvania began registering immigrants and requiring oaths of loyalty. To discourage poor migrants from coming, they imposed a 40-shilling tax. These laws later influenced the U.S. Naturalization Act of 1790. Lee notes that registry can be viewed as one of the earliest examples of state-sanctioned xenophobia in American history. But significantly, the laws did not restrict immigration or change the terms of naturalization. In fact, they provided an important mechanism to facilitate naturalization and to incorporate strangers and foreigners into the colony. The German Pennsylvanians earned their whiteness during the 7 Years' War by serving faithfully against Native Americans. Lee points out that afterwards the term savage became associated exclusively with Native Americans, while Germans were now considered white. With this newfound acceptance, German settlers exercised their political power, voting Benjamin Franklin out of his seat in the state assembly. the ugly election became a referendum on migrant attitudes, with one party courting the German vote and stirring the public by reprinting Franklin's anti-German rhetoric. The strategy worked, boosting turnout by 30% over previous elections. Their citizenship, which had been earned through military service, had granted the Germans political power, something that the 1790 Naturalization Act denied to women and any immigrant groups deemed to be non-white. These racial barriers remained in place until 1952. In a closely divided electorate, small voting blocs can sway an election. Some political parties court these groups with promises to address their concerns. Others weaponize xenophobia, turning fear of newcomers into a tool to mobilize their own voters, often making immigrants' lives harder in the process. That was the strategy of the Know Nothing Party, which rose to prominence in the mid-19th century. The Kansas-Nebraska Act collapsed the Whigs, leaving an opening for a new major party to challenge the Democrats. This time, Irish immigrants became the focal point for anti-migrant groups. The Know-Nothings began as secret societies, subscribing to the conspiracy theory that Catholics answered directly to the Pope rather than their local leaders. Their name derived from their penchant for secrecy. When asked about their platform, members would reply, "I know nothing." Irish migrants fleeing the potato famine became the party's lightning rod. Massachusetts was a hot spot. The state had industrialized rapidly and received a disproportionate share of Irish immigrants, according to a Harvard working paper. At one point, only 3 men in the state Congress were from parties other than the Know-Nothings. But the party's hostility went beyond religion. Historian Erica Lee explains that the racialization of Irish Catholics as biologically inferior to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants helped establish a pattern of racial xenophobia that would dominate the late 19th and 20th centuries. Through Irish immigration to the United States, race came to mean more than just white versus black. Scientists started categorizing humanity into different racial groups by ascribing inherited and immutable characteristics. Groups like the Know-Nothings transformed xenophobia into an organized political movement. They demonized foreigners. They formed a political party devoted to curbing the rights and influence of immigrants and naturalized citizens. They mobilized voters to elect anti-immigrant lawmakers, make anti-immigrant policy, and gain political power. In short, they spearheaded the birth of political xenophobia in the United States. If that all sounds familiar, you aren't alone, as historians Susan Storer Clark, Nicholas Mosvik, and Terry Golway have all written major papers whose titles ask the question, are the Know-Nothings back? James Carville's political statement of "it's the economy, stupid," can be applied to nearly every facet of history. Immigration often rises during periods of economic growth, as migrants fill labor holes that benefit both employers and consumers. During recessions, however, resentment grows. The United Nations Global Migration Group notes that history shows that times of economic depression have a negative impact on social cohesion. All previous crises of the 1900s affected migration in distinct ways and spurred resentment of foreigners. In the 1840s, the Irish accounted for an astonishing 45% of all new arrivals to the United States. The Library of Congress explains that they often entered the workforce at the bottom. Men labored in coal mines, built railroads and canals, while women worked as servants or domestic laborers. Railroad construction was so dangerous that it was said there was an Irishman buried under every rail. Over time, many Irish Americans climbed the occupational ladder through politically appointed positions, becoming policemen, firemen, and teachers. Capitalism always generates winners and losers. Employers used immigrant labor to pressure non-immigrant workers into accepting lower wages. In Boston, which is sometimes called the Dublin of America, Irish immigrants competed with each other, prompting some to move west, which diluted their political influence but fueled conspiracy theorists like preacher Lyman Beecher, as well as inventor Samuel Morse. Beecher argued that the West had to remain Protestant to defend against Catholic Canada and Mexico. His 1835 book warned that Catholic priests and monarchs would decide our elections, perplex our policy, inflame and divide the nation, break the bond of our union, and throw down our free institutions by manipulating Irish Catholics. Morse echoed the fear in foreign conspiracy against the liberties of the United States, portraying Irish immigration as part of a foreign plot to take over America. Anti-Catholicism xenophobia reached all-time heights with the publication of The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. Claiming to be a work of non-fiction, the bestseller claimed that nuns were being forced to sleep with Catholic priests. When such a coupling resulted in a pregnancy, the babies were quickly baptized and then promptly strangled to death before being dumped into a lime pit in the convent's basement. Though the work is a hoax, the book is still widely available today on popular sites such as Amazon. Such hate-filled conspiracies led to the Bloody Monday riots in Louisville, sparked by false rumors that Irish and German immigrants were stockpiling weapons in Catholic churches. Know-nothings issued yellow tickets to approved voters, and then demanded that all voters that showed up show them before actually casting their vote. Immigrants with foreign accents had to produce naturalization papers, a throwback to the tired argument that immigrants were illegally influencing elections. Violence subsequently followed. 500 Know-Nothing rioters torched German and Irish neighborhoods. They burned the Cathedral of the Assumption while searching for non-existent weapons, as well as attacking residents who were attempting to escape. Lee recounts that only after the mayor searched the premises and found no stashed weapons did the mob turn away, but not before a Catholic priest was stoned to death. The mob then raided Armbruster's brewery, helping themselves to apple and peach brandy, before setting it aflame, killing 10 more people. Residents who tried to escape the Irish apartments on Quinns Row were shot. As the sun set, the skies in Louisville glowed red from the flames of burning buildings, and the city's streets were stained with blood. It was in 1855, the same year as the Louisville riots, that the Know-Nothings tried to take their hate agenda mainstream. Lee explains that their platform relied on yet another tired argument. Immigrants were the chief source of crime in the country. Their love of alcohol led to public drunkenness, liquor trafficking, and crime. This long-standing myth has been repeatedly debunked. The Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition notes that this idea has deep roots in American history, resurfacing time and again, often during moments of political tension or change. Despite its persistence, there is no factual basis to support it. In reality, this narrative has been used to justify harsh enforcement tactics, detention, and deportations. The data tells a very different story. Communities with higher immigrant populations tend to experience less violence. Many immigrants live in constant fear of legal trouble or deportation. So drawing attention to themselves is the last thing they want. They're focused on working hard and building safer lives for their families. Long-term studies back this up. Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research examined more than 140 years of crime statistics and found that first-generation immigrants are significantly less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born individuals. Today, immigrants are 60% less likely to be imprisoned than native-born citizens. Yet despite the evidence, the myth persists. To make it stick, the Know-Nothings created enduring caricatures of Irish immigrants. The male, Paddy, was dark-skinned, dirty, fiery-haired, rosy-cheeked, ape-like, and associated with high-pitched screeches and violent behavior. Bridget, the stereotypical Irish woman, was portrayed as a peasant trying to steal her mistress' fine china. These caricatures were part of a broader effort to establish pseudo-scientific racial hierarchies. At the time, the Irish were ranked just above the enslaved African Americans, who in 1855 were still held almost entirely in the South. To protect their place in this constructed hierarchy, Irish immigrants often embraced pro-slavery and anti-black bias. Lee notes, vulnerable themselves to charges that they were racially inferior, Irish Americans often used anti-black racism as a way to prove their whiteness. The Know-Nothing Party captured 8 governorships, controlled 9 state legislatures, and elected more than 100 congressmen. Their most successful legislative effort was a deportation policy that broadened the state's authority to expel immigrants. Over 13 years, more than 15,000 immigrants were forcibly removed from Massachusetts alone. Rather than showing compassion, officials separated families, ignored health needs, and sent people overseas without regard for their wishes. Lee notes that officials often forcefully and sometimes illegally removed people without the required court warrants. They also unlawfully expelled American citizens of Irish descent, despite the fact that state law explicitly allowed only non-citizens to be sent overseas. Pushback eventually led to the party's collapse around the Civil War. Pennsylvania's Germans had already managed to prove their whiteness through military service during the French and Indian War. The Irish proved their worth by turning out in large numbers for the North, prompting Abraham Lincoln to insist on a pro-immigration plank in the Republican platform during his re-election campaign. It read, "Foreign immigration, which in the past has added so much to the wealth, development of resources, and increase of nations, should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy." The Democrats, who later became known as the Dixiecrats, made no such adjustment to their official party platform. Instead, they aligned with the Immigration Restriction League, or IRL, using the Chinese Exclusion Act as a template to differentiate between kinds of whiteness. They eventually gave their movement a name: eugenics. Using head size, nose shape, hair and eye color, and more, they created an official hierarchy of races, claiming that instead of one white race, there were many. Such rankings had happened before, but in the words of Lee, they also invented a new way of spreading and legislating xenophobia, publicizing its xenophobic positions with statistics and junk science in the nation's most respected academic and non-academic journals. The IRL became the nation's first anti-immigrant think tank and lobbying firm. This trend persists today. In 2018, the National Speech and Debate Association chose to debate a topic which called for reducing America's restrictions on legal immigration. As a coach, I was insanely frustrated to watch high school students espouse evidence that came from groups like the Center for Immigration Studies. If you know nothing about that organization, it looks just like any other public policy think tank. It even carries the slogan, "Low Immigration, Pro-Immigrant," at the top of its webpage. The Southern Poverty Law Center, however, classifies the organization as a hate group, revealing that the organization has a decades-long history of circulating racist writers while also associating with white nationalists. Illinois Representative Luis Gutierrez points out that their research is always questionable because they torture the data to make it arrive at the conclusion they desire, which is that immigrants are criminals and a burden on the U.S. and our economy. It is the worst kind of deception, but politicians, the conservative media, and some Americans eat it up because it always looks somewhat legitimate at first glance. Only once you're sucked in after reading a few articles that look legitimate do you end up clicking on articles titled "Terror Babies Go Legit." That particular actual article suggests that terrorists come illegally to America to have an anchor baby, a U.S. citizen that allows its parents to remain in America, developing a terrorist sleeper cell for their baby to inherit. My frustration wasn't that students were using such evidence in debate rounds. Arguing the quality of citations is a beneficial debate to have. But I lost it when another well-respected coach came up to me to argue his team's evidence, completely ignoring my team's truthful explanation that the argument that he encouraged his team to run was concocted by known white supremacists. In order to overcome people like me who actually do their research behind the sites that they use, the IRL flooded the zone, a logical fallacy known as card stacking. They published 140,000 of its pamphlets and were published in more than 500 newspapers nationwide. In 1917, Congress succeeded in passing a literacy test, a head tax, and systematic discrimination against immigrants, quote-unquote, afflicted with homosexuality. The measure increased the government's emphasis on restricting immigration rather than just regulating it. The IRL were also influential in getting the 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts passed, slowing immigration to a mere trickle. Their primary targets were Eastern and Southern Europeans, particularly Jews from Russia and Italians. I will have a separate episode in this series on Jews, so forgive me for ignoring them in favor of the Italians, another white group that was lumped in with African Americans at the beginning of their immigrant story. America happened to enter an economic recession in 1893, just as large numbers of Italians were arriving at Ellis Island. Lee explains that the Immigration Restriction League considered Italians one of the more ignorant races of Europe, racialized as primitive, prone to violence, anarchy, criminality, poverty, and rebellion. They were commonly described as savage, swarthy, or dark-skinned, and yoked them to Native Americans and African Americans. The 1911 U.S. Immigration Commission codified this false science, claiming that certain kinds of criminality were inherent to Italians. Although we might immediately think of the mafia, xenophobic Americans were more concerned about anarchists. Sacco and Vanzetti, Italian immigrants, were executed in a notoriously shady trial during the first Red Scare. Similarly, the Haymarket riot had been triggered by a pipe bomb set off by an Italian arsonist. Literacy tests also migrated north from the Jim Crow South to limit their entry, but Democratic President Grover Cleveland vetoed these measures, reminding the nation that immigrants are now numbered among our best citizens. In trying to keep the Italians out, the IRL found an ally in Madison Grant, the era's most prominent eugenist. His book, The Passing of the Great Race, claimed that race determined the trajectory of civilizations, some producing great men, others stagnating or collapsing. Grant also advanced another tired argument, stating that women of inferior races were prolific breeders, threatening race suicide by diluting the purity of white bloodlines. President Teddy Roosevelt embraced this thinking, criticizing families with only 2 children as selfish, fearing that white Americans would vanish in 2 or 3 generations. Roosevelt died during World War I, but he would have been pleased with the 1924 Immigration Act, which for the first time imposed strict numerical limits. Based on 1910 population data, the act admitted only 2% of each nationality already in the U.S., effectively shutting the door on most Southern and Eastern Europeans. Lee notes that Madison Grant could not help but gloat. He claimed that his book's purpose to rouse his fellow Americans to the overwhelming importance of race and to the folly of the melting pot theory had been thoroughly accomplished. The immigration of undesirable races and people had been stopped. The new quotas were extreme: 65,000 Brits, 25,000 Germans, 17,000 Irish, but only 5,000 Italians, just 3,000 Russians, and a mere 845 from Yugoslavia. Most countries, including India, China, Egypt, and South Africa, were limited to just 100 people per year. These restrictions remained in place until 1965. Even today, legal immigration involves long waits. Some people try to cut the line, while others with connections can bypass it entirely. The Immigration and Nationality Act caps green cards from any single country at 7% of the total issued, meaning smaller nations like Iceland or Luxembourg have almost no wait, while Mexico and India average 8 years, and China 5.5. The 1924 Act's impact was immediate. Annual immigration to the U.S. fell by 50%. Its effects were noted abroad, most notoriously by Adolf Hitler. 1 year after being released from prison following his failed coup attempt, Hitler wrote to Madison Grant, calling the eugenics book his Bible. Lee explains, the Nazis frequently praised the United States for standing at the forefront of race-based lawmaking. They admired not only America's system of Jim Crow segregation, but also its immigration and naturalization laws and the creation of de jure and de facto second-class citizenship for African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans. America became, in Hitler's view, a racial model for Europe. 14 years later, Hitler's stormtroopers carried out Kristallnacht, torching Jewish businesses and synagogues while terrorizing their people. By then, a quarter of Germany's Jews had already been expelled from the country. In a chilling way, American xenophobia had provided a blueprint for the first phase of the Holocaust. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every little bit goes a long way. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.